Hey guys, tonight let's do that thing where we dim the lights, put the phone face down, and agree that nothing urgent is happening for the next little while. No emails, no notifications, no sudden life realizations. Just history. Slow history. Calm history. History that politely asks you to fall asleep halfway through a sentence and doesn't take it personally. Tonight we're talking about Nelson Mandela, which is interesting because Mandela's one of those historical figures who feels almost too important. Like you're not sure if you're allowed to yawn while listening. But don't worry, we're going to ease into this gently. No shouting, no dramatic music. Just one very long, very patient man and a country that took its sweet time figuring things out. So get comfortable. This is not a hype speech. This is a slow walk, a very long walk, the kind that takes 27 years, several prisons, a lot of paperwork, and more restraint than any human should reasonably be expected to have. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born in 1918, which already tells you something important. This man entered the world at a time when everything was unfair and everyone in charge thought that was perfectly fine. He was born in a small village called Mvezo in South Africa's Eastern Cape into the Thembu royal family. Yes, royal. Not the shiny crown kind, more like local aristocracy with cows and expectations. His birth name, Rolihlahla, roughly translates to pulling the branch of a tree, which is a polite way of saying troublemaker. So that's fun. The universe basically labeled him at birth and said, good luck with that. The name Nelson came later, courtesy of a British teacher who decided African names were inconvenient, because of course she did. So she just handed him a Western name like it was a spare pencil. And that's how one of the most important political figures of the 20th century ended up with the most aggressively ordinary first name imaginable. Young Mandela grew up herding cattle, listening to elders tell stories, and absorbing a very clear understanding of hierarchy. Not just who was in charge, but why, and more importantly, who wasn't. His father died when Mandela was still a child, which meant he was taken in by the acting king of the Thembu people. So Mandela spent his formative years watching leadership up close. Not flashy leadership, slow, ceremonial, deeply patient leadership. The kind where everyone speaks, everyone listens, and decisions take forever. Which honestly explains a lot later. Mandela was smart, painfully so. The kind of smart that gets you into trouble because you start asking questions that make people uncomfortable. He went to mission schools, learned English, learned about British ideas of law and justice, all while living under a system that absolutely did not apply those ideas equally. At Fort Hare University, one of the few places Black South Africans could get a higher education, Mandela studied law, and promptly got himself expelled because he joined a student protest. So early pattern established. After that, he fled to Johannesburg to avoid an arranged marriage, which is one of those historical footnotes that feels very human. Future global icon, future Nobel Prize winner, future symbol of reconciliation. Also, a guy who said, actually, no, I don't want that marriage, I'm going to the city. In Johannesburg, Mandela worked as a security guard, then as a clerk at a law firm. This is where things start to simmer. He saw apartheid up close, not as an abstract idea, but as paperwork, as rules, as doors that closed quietly in your face. Apartheid, for context, was South Africa's official system of racial segregation. Official, bureaucratic, and obsessively detailed. Everything was classified: where you could live, who you could marry, what jobs you could have, which park bench was for you, which one wasn't. And Mandela, being a law student, read the fine print, which somehow made it worse. In the 1940s, Mandela joined the African National Congress, or ANC. At first, he was very much a believer in peaceful protest. Marches, petitions, speeches delivered with hope and optimism. This phase does not last forever. History rarely allows that. Mandela helped form the ANC Youth League, which was essentially the "we're tired of waiting" branch of the organization. They were impatient. They were idealistic. They believed things could change quickly. Spoiler, they did not. By the 1950s, Mandela was married, practicing law, and deeply involved in resistance politics. He and Oliver Tambo opened the first black law firm in Johannesburg, which meant they were immediately overwhelmed with clients whose lives had been crushed by apartheid legislation. People came in desperate. Mandela listened, and slowly, carefully, his optimism hardened into resolve. The government, meanwhile, noticed him, which is never a great sign. Mandela was arrested multiple times, banned from speaking publicly, restricted in where he could go, restricted in who he could meet, which is an impressive amount of effort to silence one man. Eventually, after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police killed dozens of unarmed protesters, Mandela reached a conclusion that made him deeply uncomfortable. Peaceful protest alone was not working. This is where history likes to argue. This is where documentaries start using dramatic lighting, but we're not doing that tonight. Mandela helped form Mkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. Its mission was sabotage, not terrorism. Infrastructure, symbols of the state, carefully planned, minimal loss of life. Still, the government labeled him a terrorist because of course they did. In 1962, Mandela was arrested again. This time, it stuck. At the Rivonia trial, Mandela gave a speech that would be legendary. He talked about democracy, equality, the idea of a society where all people live together in harmony. He ended with the line that he was prepared to die for that ideal. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Mandela was 42 years old. He was sent to Robben Island, which is not the kind of island with palm trees and cocktails. It's cold, windy, bleak, the kind of place that quietly erodes your soul if you let it. Mandela was prisoner 466/64, meaning he was the 466th prisoner admitted in 1964, a number that followed him everywhere. His cell was tiny, bare concrete, a mat on the floor, no privacy, no comfort, and for years, no books. Prison authorities tried to break him slowly. Hard labor, lime quarries that damaged his eyes, letters censored, visits restricted. His marriage collapsed under the strain. His children grew up without him. His mother died. His eldest son died in a car accident. He was not allowed to attend the funeral. And through all of this, Mandela did something deeply irritating to his captors. He remained calm. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his jailers, because he wanted to understand them, which is either strategic genius or emotional masochism, possibly both. He treated guards with respect, not submission, respect. And over time, some of them began to respect him back. Years passed, then more years, then entire decades. Outside the prison, Mandela became a symbol, a face on posters, a name chanted at rallies, a man most South Africans had never heard speak. Inside the prison, he aged, slowly, deliberately, with more patience than anyone deserves credit for. By the 1980s, international pressure on South Africa was mounting. Sanctions, boycotts, global embarrassment. The government began quietly talking to Mandela, testing the waters, seeing if he'd compromise. They offered him conditional release. He said no. He would not accept freedom while others remained oppressed, which is the kind of moral consistency that sounds great in history books and is absolutely exhausting in real life. Mandela stayed in prison. And that's where we'll gently pause for now, not with a cliffhanger, just with a long exhale, because the story doesn't rush. Neither should we. So let's leave Mandela there for the moment, still imprisoned, still patient, still quietly becoming inevitable. When you're ready, we'll continue. All right, let's drift back in. Same room, same dim lighting, same very patient man sitting in a concrete cell, aging one slow breath at a time. When we left off, Nelson Mandela was still in prison, which, historically speaking, is where he spent a lot of time. 27 years, to be precise. Long enough for fashion trends to cycle twice. Long enough for governments to rise and fall. Long enough for the world to start wondering if this man was even real or just a really persuasive rumor. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Mandela was no longer just a prisoner. He was a problem. Not because he was violent, not because he was loud, but because he refused to disappear. The apartheid government had done everything right according to its own logic. They arrested him, they isolated him, they cut him off from public life, they locked him on an island and gave him a number. And yet, there he was, still looming, still being talked about, still making them uncomfortable without saying a word. Inside prison, Mandela's life had settled into a strange rhythm. Wake up, roll up the sleeping mat, hard labor, meals designed to remind you of your place, endless rules, endless waiting. But Mandela adopted. He negotiated. Small things at first. Long pants instead of shorts, better food rations, the right to study. This is something people sometimes miss. Mandela didn't just endure prison. He worked prison. Slowly, politely, relentlessly. He became a leader among the prisoners, an informal mediator, a walking constitution in human form. Disputes happened. Mandela listened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just absorbed everything, which is unsettling in a way violence never is. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, South Africa was cracking. Apartheid was becoming more expensive to maintain, economically, politically, morally. Protests escalated. Townships erupted. The government responded with states of emergency, police violence, and a lot of denial. And somewhere in all of this chaos, Mandela became a symbol so powerful that the government could no longer ignore him. They moved him off Robben Island in 1982, officially for security reasons, unofficially because he was influencing younger prisoners, which is an incredible compliment if you think about it. He was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland. The conditions were marginally better: a bed, a desk, actual walls that didn't smell like despair and sea salt. And this is where things get quietly interesting. The government started talking to him. Not publicly, not confidently, very carefully, like someone approaching a sleeping animal they're not sure is actually asleep. They wanted to know if Mandela would negotiate, if he would renounce violence, if he would help stabilize the situation. Mandela listened, and then he asked a simple question. What authority would I have if my organization remains banned and my people remain oppressed? Which is an annoyingly reasonable thing to say. Years went by like this. Secret meetings, polite conversations, no headlines. Mandela aged into his 60s in prison. His hair went gray, his body weakened, his lungs suffered from years of quarry dust in cold cells. But his mind stayed sharp, almost irritatingly so. In 1985, the government offered him release again, conditional release. He could walk free if he publicly rejected the armed struggle. Mandela refused, from prison, via a message read aloud at a rally. It was calm, measured, firm. I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Which is one of those sentences that sounds very composed and probably took a lot of self-control not to scream. By the late 1970s, apartheid was collapsing under its own weight. International sanctions were biting hard. The economy was strained. White South Africans were increasingly aware that this system had an expiration date. And Mandela was still there, waiting. In 1988, he was hospitalized with tuberculosis, which in a strange way humanized him to the regime. This wasn't just a symbol anymore. This was an old man with failing lungs who had outlasted several presidents. They moved him again, this time to Victor Verster Prison. And now, quietly, subtly, everything changed. Mandela was given a small house, a garden, privacy. It was still prison, but it was also preparation. The government, now under President F.W. de Klerk, had come to a realization it probably hated.
There was no future without Mandela. So they talked. A lot. Mandela insisted on one thing above all else. Any negotiation had to involve the ANC, and apartheid had to end. Not soften, not rebrand, end. In February 1990, after 27 years, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. He was 71 years old. The world watched. Televisions everywhere. That raised fist, that slow, careful walk. He looked calm. He looked composed. He looked like someone who had been rehearsing this moment internally for decades. And then he spoke. Not with anger, not with revenge, with reconciliation, which frankly stunned everyone. Mandela didn't call for violence. He didn't call for purges. He didn't demand immediate retribution. He called for negotiations, for unity, for patience, which is an absolutely wild position to take after 27 years in prison. The early 1990s in South Africa were tense. Violence didn't magically stop. Political assassinations happened. Extremists on all sides tried to derail the process. Mandela traveled constantly. He spoke endlessly. He listened even more. He met with former enemies, shared tea, smiled politely, and slowly, impossibly, apartheid was dismantled. Laws repealed, bans lifted, political prisoners released. In 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial democratic election. Millions voted for the first time. Lines stretched for hours. People waited patiently because patience had become a national habit. Nelson Mandela was elected president at 73, which is an age when most people are aggressively done with responsibility. Mandela's presidency was not flashy. It was symbolic, intentional, deeply aware of its fragility. He wore the Springbok rugby jersey, a symbol of white Afrikaner identity, to unify the country. He invited former jailers to his inauguration. He formed a government of national unity. And perhaps most famously, he supported the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was not about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. Tell the truth. Be heard. Move forward. Not everyone liked it. Some wanted trials. Some wanted vengeance. Mandela understood something difficult. A country can't heal if it's constantly reopening wounds with a knife. He served one term. One. Then he stepped aside. No power clinging, no just one more term, no dramatic exit. He retired. And that, somehow, made his legacy even stronger. Nelson Mandela lived long enough to see his country free, long enough to become a global icon, long enough to be quoted on posters and mugs and motivational calendars, which is always a little ironic considering how much time he spent being ignored. He died in 2013 at the age of 95, and his story remains what it always was. Not loud, not fast, not explosive, just steady, patient, unyielding. A reminder that sometimes the most disruptive thing a person can do is refuse to become bitter. And on that quiet note, we'll let the story rest. No dramatic ending, just a long, earned silence.
So now Mandela is president, which sounds like the end of the story. Cue credits, soft music, fade to black. Except history doesn't really do endings. It does aftermaths. And Mandela's aftermath is long, complicated, and quietly exhausting. Because once you become a symbol, people stop seeing you as a person. They project things onto you: hope, forgiveness, impossible moral clarity. And Mandela, very politely, carried all of it. During his presidency, the world treated him like a saint who occasionally attended summits. He was invited everywhere, given awards constantly, photographed smiling next to people who would have arrested him 20 years earlier. And Mandela smiled back, because of course he did. But governing South Africa was not a victory lap. It was triage. The country was deeply unequal. The economy was fragile. Millions were still poor. Expectations were dangerously high. Mandela knew this,
which is why his presidency focused less on radical transformation and more on stability. Some people admired that. Others were disappointed. There were critics who said he compromised too much, that he forgave too easily, that reconciliation came at the expense of justice. Mandela didn't argue much with these critiques. He listened, nodded, and kept doing what he believed was necessary to prevent civil war, because that was always the alternative. It's easy to forget how close South Africa came to complete collapse, how fragile those negotiations were, how easily everything could have gone wrong. Mandela governed like someone who had seen the worst-case scenario up close, because he had. Privately, his life was not peaceful. His marriage to Winnie Mandela had effectively ended long before his release. Prison doesn't strengthen relationships, it freezes them in time and then shatters them on release. Winnie had become a powerful, controversial figure in her own right, admired by many, criticized by others, linked to violence and abuses that made Mandela deeply uncomfortable. Their divorce in 1996 was painful and public, and deeply ironic. The man who united a nation could not save his own marriage. Mandela didn't pretend otherwise. He admitted his personal failures openly, especially as a father. His children had grown up without him. Some were distant, some resentful, some simply strangers. This is one of the quiet tragedies of Mandela's life. The sacrifice was real, and it was permanent. After stepping down as president in 1999, Mandela entered what most people would call retirement. But for him, that just meant different work. He focused on HIV/AIDS awareness, a topic the government had mishandled badly. He supported peace efforts across Africa. He continued to appear at events, smiling patiently as people asked him to embody hope. His health declined, slowly, predictably. The years in prison had taken their toll. Lung infections, fatigue, long periods of rest. And yet he remained publicly gracious, always measured, always calm. Mandela became a universal symbol in a way few people ever do. Everyone claimed him. Politicians quoted him selectively. Brands borrowed his image. Motivational speakers flattened his life into neat slogans. And Mandela let it happen, because he understood something uncomfortable. People don't want complexity. They want reassurance. But if you look closely, very closely, Mandela never claimed to be perfect. He never claimed to have all the answers. He described himself as stubborn, as flawed, as someone who learned slowly and often painfully. That humility is part of what made him dangerous to unjust systems. By the time of his death in 2013, Mandela had become almost mythological. World leaders mourned, crowds gathered, speeches flowed. And somewhere beneath all of that ceremony was a man who had spent most of his adult life waiting. In cells, in negotiations, in conversations where nothing happened quickly. Mandela's legacy isn't about a single moment. It's about endurance, about emotional restraint so extreme it feels almost unreal, about choosing not to escalate when escalation would have been justified, which is frankly exhausting just to think about. And that's where the sleepless historian version of Mandela ends. Not with fireworks, not with triumph, but with a quiet realization that the most radical thing Mandela ever did was stay human in a system designed to strip that away. We can continue after this, deeper into the myths, the misquotes, the uncomfortable comparisons, and the way Mandela is remembered versus who he actually was. Or we can let this part settle. Just say the word.